They burned the records. They buried the witnesses. But the whispers, they never stopped. Behind the velvet curtain of divine power and stained glass lies a truth so vile, so unspeakable, even the Vatican still denies it. This is not just history. This is infection. And once it enters your mind, it never leaves. The year is 1492. Rome is a rotting empire in disguise, dressed in the holy robes of the Church. But beneath those robes, blood, lust, and power fester in the open. In the shadows of the Sistine Chapel, before Michelangelo touched the ceiling, a family rises. The Borgia family. You've heard the name. But not like this. Rodrigo Borgia, soon to become Pope Alexander VI, isn't a holy man. He's a predator cloaked in sanctity. He doesn't confess sin. He invents it. And he doesn't love his daughter. He possesses her. Her name is Lucrezia. They called her a temptress. A poisoner. A seductress in silk. But history is a mirror shattered by the hands of those in power. And every fragment tells a different lie. She was never the villain. She was the victim of an empire's darkest hunger, control of the flesh, the mind, and the soul. Rodrigo wanted more than God. He wanted to make himself a god. And gods, in his twisted theology, create their own altars. Lucrezia became one. But here's what they never told you in school. The incest wasn't whispered behind closed doors, it was paraded through palaces. It was orchestrated, weaponized, and ritualized. His son, Cesare, cold-eyed, brilliant, and loyal to no law but his father's, was more than a brother to Lucrezia. He was her jailer. Her lover. Her curse. They turned their daughter into a tool, a symbol, a womb for dynastic supremacy. And yet, the Church looked away. Because the real corruption isn't in secret, it's in the silence of those who know and do nothing. Ask yourself, why would the holiest man in Christendom need to engineer incest? Why would he desecrate his own bloodline? The answer isn't lust. It's control. If you think this was a one-time perversion of history, think again. This wasn't just a family scandal. It was a blueprint. And once you see the pattern, you'll never unsee it. Keep watching, they tell you power is won on battlefields or bought in gold. But that's a child's version of reality. Real power is cultivated behind doors you'll never open, by men you're told to revere. The Borgia legacy wasn't built by accident, it was engineered like a cathedral of sin, brick by brick, lie by lie. Rodrigo Borgia didn't ascend the papacy through divine favor. He bought it. Simony, the purchase of sacred office, was the worst sin in canon law. But for Rodrigo, it was just another negotiation. He bribed, he threatened, he promised positions to cardinals like chips at a gaming table. And when the white smoke finally rose, it didn't signal God's will. It signaled a deal had been sealed in blood. And who was there, at the center of this unholy rise? Lucrezia. Even as a child, she was a pawn in her father's empire. Engaged by the age of 11. Married off at 13. Not for love. Never for love. But to extend the reach of Rodrigo's influence, to embed the Borgia seed into every noble house across Italy. You see, Rodrigo didn't just crave power. He wanted to own history, to write it with his own hands, using his children as the ink. And Lucrezia, beautiful and obedient, was the most valuable quill. But something changed. At one point, Rodrigo stopped hiding his obsession. He began to adore Lucrezia publicly. Not as a father. Not even as a pope. But as something else entirely. Letters between court officials, hidden for centuries, describe him kissing her mouth too long, holding her too close, whispering things no father should. They say Cesare grew jealous. Not as a brother, but as a rival. What kind of family breeds that kind of darkness? The kind that believes blood is power, and power must stay pure. You think incest is a perversion. To them, it was strategy. Royal bloodlines across Europe followed the same script, cousin marrying cousin, niece married to uncle. But the Borgias pushed the boundary even further, fusing father to daughter, brother to sister, under the banner of God. This wasn't desire. This was alchemy. The transmutation of flesh into influence. The desecration of family in the name of legacy. And no one stopped them. Because the higher you go in any hierarchy, the less anyone speaks. Silence is the real sacrament of the elite. Understand this, what they did to Lucrezia wasn't just abuse. It was ritual. Still want to keep watching? Good. Because the descent is just beginning. You've heard of devils wearing red. But you've never seen one in white. Pope Alexander VI wasn't just a political creature. He was a spiritual tyrant. Not in spite of the church, but through it. He didn't twist religion for power. He used religion because it was the most potent form of psychological control ever devised. 1 billion souls shackled by guilt, fear, and eternal damnation. What weapon could ever rival that? While peasants feared hell, Rodrigo forged his own heaven, here on earth. And in that false paradise, Lucrezia became a vessel. Not just for incest, not just for alliances, but for sacrilege made flesh. Her bedrooms were not private. Her body was not hers. Her marriages weren't endings, they were openings. Doorways to new influence. And every time her father annulled one marriage and orchestrated another, it wasn't because of scandal. It was because the ritual had to evolve. The pawn had to shift. The web had to tighten. And Cesare, her brother, watched it all, played his part, and drank deeply from the same poisoned well. You want to understand how incest becomes policy? Look deeper. This wasn't about lust. It was about the consolidation of loyalty. The deeper the sin, the stronger the bond. If a man commits a crime with you, he belongs to you. But if a man commits a crime against his own blood, then he's beyond return. That's not just psychological. That's spiritual enslavement. It's how cults work. It's how intelligence agencies work. And it's how the most powerful families in history have operated for centuries. Ritual corruption binds tighter than love ever could. Lucrezia was never allowed to be human. She was programmed. Conditioned. Groomed in gold and silk to carry out unspeakable acts with a smile. She hosted family banquets, where cardinals watched as her father and brother lavished her with affections so overt, guests whispered it was theater. But theater for whom? Not for the public. No. It was for the other priests. The men being trained to obey, to remain silent, to mirror what they saw. The Vatican wasn't just complicit. It was complicit because it needed to be. Because if you can normalize depravity at the top, then obedience becomes effortless below. And here's the chilling truth, the higher you climb in any sacred institution, the closer you get to something unholy. You still think this was just about one family? Think again. Because the blueprint they carved, was adopted, power doesn't replicate through words, it replicates through ritual. The Borgia incest wasn't an accident of sin, it was a method. And methods, once proven effective, become doctrines. The question is not why Rodrigo Borgia did what he did, it's why so many followed after. Because when you corrupt the sacred, you don't just dominate people's actions, you invade their conscience. You write yourself into the architecture of their morality. That's the secret. Not just control of territory, but control of meaning. Lucrezia's story became legend because she was made to embody contradiction. A virgin and a seductress. A daughter and a lover. A saint and a poisoner. They smeared her as the Black Widow of Rome, but ask yourself, who wrote the scripts that survive? Who funded the archives? Who decided which tales lived and which ones vanished into the vaults? The victors of history are not always kings. Often, they're priests with pens soaked in censorship. What the church feared most wasn't scandal, it was pattern recognition. Because if the public began to notice that the very men preaching virtue were consecrating incest behind palace doors, the illusion would fracture. And if the illusion breaks, the architecture collapses. You're not just looking at a family gone wrong. You're looking at a test case. The Borgia family normalized depravity by masking it in gold. They blurred the lines between reverence and violation. Rodrigo wasn't punished. Cesare wasn't exiled. Lucrezia wasn't saved. The world kept turning. Because institutions don't self-destruct, they adapt. You want to know how deep this goes? Look at how often incest recurs in royal bloodlines. Look at how often powerful dynasties, from Egypt to Europe, sealed blood within blood. They didn't do this out of madness. They did it to concentrate power. To keep it untainted by outsiders. To close the circle. And the church? The church watched. Sometimes it condemned. More often, it quietly absorbed. Because the lesson Rodrigo left behind was this: if you dress your crimes in enough ceremony, people will kneel before them. The Vatican archives, hundreds of feet beneath the earth, still hide the most explicit letters. Eyewitness accounts. Even paintings, hidden away. They say Lucrezia once sat on her father's throne during Mass. That Cesare stood beside her with a naked sword. That priests bent the knee. To her. To them. To something else. And that was no accident. Are you ready to descend further? Because it's time to confront what the church truly became after the Borgias. There's a reason the Vatican has its own country. Its own bank. Its own laws. You think it's about independence. It's not. It's about insulation. About shielding the center of global control from the very eyes it claims to serve. Rodrigo Borgia knew this before anyone. That's why he didn't just bend the church, he weaponized it. And after him, others followed. The incestuous core of the Borgia dynasty was not erased, it was absorbed, repurposed, buried beneath centuries of polished marble and holy chants. But it lives. In every institution that claims moral authority while hiding atrocities in silence. Because after you defile the sacred once, and no lightning strikes, you realize the game isn't divine. It's human. And humans are programmable. Rodrigo understood this. He created theater. Grand, opulent ceremonies where sin was wrapped in robes, crowned with incense, masked by scripture. He taught the elite this lesson: if you make the ritual beautiful enough, no one will see the horror beneath it. And so the church evolved, not away from corruption, but through it. After the Borgia reign, the Vatican didn't cleanse itself. It codified the hierarchy. It hardened the walls. It professionalized the art of silence. Confession became surveillance. Penance became obedience. And guilt, weaponized guilt, became the leash. Understand this: the Vatican's power has never been faith. It's control of perception. A global apparatus that teaches billions of people to mistrust their instincts, to look upward for absolution, and to silence the voice that says, "This is wrong." Now ask yourself, if one pope could transform his daughter into a tool of incest and diplomacy without consequence, what else has been done behind the veil? Why do you think the Vatican holds more classified documents than any government? Why are its archives off limits to the public, guarded by Swiss mercenaries, hidden behind biometric locks and 15-foot doors? Because it's not just history in those vaults. It's methods. The Borgia blueprint was never discarded. It was refined. Adapted. Taught. And you, watching this now, were never meant to know it. They want you distracted by scandals. By surface-level shame. by stories of bad popes and corrupt officials. But the rot was never the exception. It was the foundation. And if you think this is just about the church, you're not listening closely enough. We're only halfway down. Now we enter the layer they truly fear you reaching, the one where patterns become undeniable, where names and faces fade and all that remains is structure. The Borgia crimes weren't isolated. They were ritualized operations encoded into the DNA of institutional power. And once you see the system for what it is, you understand, incest wasn't a perversion. It was a cipher. A signal to the inner circle that the bloodline belonged to something deeper than mere family, something ancient. Something that predates Christianity, predates Rome itself. These are rites as old as Babylon. As old as Sumer. Control the blood. Control the will. Control the soul. What Rodrigo Borgia unleashed upon the church wasn't just corruption. It was reversion, a return to the old pagan orders, hidden beneath a Christian skin. Behind the cross, a serpent. Behind the Pope's throne, a hidden altar where power was fed not by prayer, but by submission. And Lucrezia? She was the perfect vessel. Beautiful, docile, intelligent. The ideal mask. They called her a monster in later histories to cover the truth. She was engineered to be a goddess of obedience. One man, centuries later, said it plainly, "Give me the child until he is 7, and I will show you the man." The Borgia method went further, "Give me the child, and I will decide whether they remain human at all." Now ask yourself, how many daughters of kings, presidents, billionaires, media moguls, are used in the same way? Sacrificed not to death, but to obedience. To secrecy. To a kind of spiritual sterilization that ensures loyalty cannot be broken. This wasn't about fatherly lust. It was about breaking the mirror of identity, until Lucrezia didn't see herself as a victim or a daughter, but as a tool. And Cesare wasn't just her brother. He was the enforcer. A military mind trained in theological warfare. The sword to Rodrigo's tongue. Together, they formed a closed loop of incestuous power, father, son, daughter. Symbolically, God, executioner, and vessel. Do you see it now? This wasn't just manipulation. It was theology inverted. A blasphemous trinity. A perverse holy family. And every institution that followed, knowingly or not, has mirrored this structure. You still think you're watching history? You're watching design. A design meant to shape you, bind you, and blind you. And now that you're starting to see, it's time to make a choice. Good. Because this is where it stops being history, and starts becoming personal. You've spent your life surrounded by symbols. Crosses, stars, eagles, serpents. But what you were never taught is this: symbols are not decorations. They are devices. Psychological anchors, embedded into architecture, ritual, and speech, designed to transmit belief without needing words. The Borgias understood this. Rodrigo didn't just corrupt his daughter, he sacramentalized the act. Made it holy. Wove it into the rituals of his papacy. At their private dinners, the seating arrangement mirrored altars. The chalices used were stolen from actual churches. Lucrezia wore papal white, untouchable, untouching. Until the doors closed. What you must grasp is this: they ritualized desecration to normalize it. They engineered reality so thoroughly that sin became structure, and structure became law. Ask yourself, how do you enslave minds for generations? You start by corrupting what is sacred: family, faith, innocence, until the people can no longer tell if the sickness is outside them or inside. This is psychological warfare perfected. And the Church learned its lesson well. After Rodrigo, the Vatican buried the records. Moved quickly to canonize distractions, scapegoat enemies, fabricate heresies. They blamed everything on Lucrezia. Called her a poisoner, a whore, a witch. Classic inversion. The predator paints the prey as dangerous to mask his own rot. But even that wasn't the end. Because Rodrigo's blueprint was not just spiritual, it was institutional. He taught the church that scandal doesn't destroy power. It strengthens it, if handled correctly. How? By creating shame in the masses and immunity for the elite. When a poor man sins, he begs for forgiveness. When a powerful man sins, he creates the rules. The Vatican remains untouched not in spite of its secrets, but because of them. And this is the real message of the Borgia reign: to rule absolutely, you must first sever the conscience. Not just yours, but everyone's. You break the human spirit not with violence, but with awe. And now that you're seeing behind the curtain, you're not who you were at the start of this video. So prove it. Comment the phrase, "The ritual was never broken." Write it twice. Once for who you were. And once for who you are becoming. Because this descent is irreversible now. You don't go back from this kind of knowledge. You only go deeper. They say history is written by the victors. But that's not true. History is written by those who control the archives. And the Vatican Archive, one of the most secretive institutions on Earth, houses over 50 miles of shelving, containing documents that span centuries of blood, conquest, heresy, and unspeakable rights. You cannot walk in. You cannot request at will. You are not meant to see. Why? Because buried in those vaults are records not of faith, but of methodology. Correspondence between cardinals during the Borgia era describing the experiment. Code words for incestuous rituals. Confessions from courtiers who vanished days later. Sketches of ceremonies where Lucrezia was placed upon altars, half Madonna, half consort, crowned not by virtue, but by violation. These weren't rumors. These were instructions. Manuals on how to weaponize the human soul. And once Rodrigo Borgia demonstrated that this system could exist in the heart of the church, untouched, the message was clear: the divine is not immune to corruption. It is the ideal camouflage for it. That's what they don't want you to understand. That the appearance of sanctity is more dangerous than open evil, because people protect it. But let's widen the scope. After the Borgias, how many more leaders modeled themselves on Rodrigo? How many dynasties replicated the internal breeding? How many cults, governments, intelligence agencies began using children the same way? You think it stopped with Rome? Look at Hollywood. Look at royal families. Look at the silent daughters in photographs, the absent mothers, the brothers too close, the fathers too praised. Look for the pattern: beauty, secrecy, control. Now, look in the mirror. How many of your beliefs were shaped by institutions that trace their power back to the Vatican? How many parts of your moral compass come from men who wore robes and destroyed innocence? The church was never just spiritual. It was logistical. A delivery system for power disguised as salvation. And Rodrigo Borgia was not the worst of them. He was just the first to show his hand completely. But they learned from him. Not to repent. To refine. You've now seen what they built into the foundation of the West. And once you know that, you can never trust the surface again. Good. You're still here. That means something inside you refuses to look away. That's the part of you they tried to kill long ago, the part that remembers truth even when the world drowns in lies. So let's sharpen the blade. Rodrigo Borgia's legacy didn't end with his death. It replicated. Not through lineage, but through method. The incest, the manipulation, the spectacle masked as piety, those were just the tools. The real virus was psychological control passed through ritual. And once that ritual is understood, it spreads. You think it stayed in the Vatican? No. It migrated. Into royal courts. Into secret societies. Into modern bureaucracies wearing suits instead of robes. Because once you realize obedience can be programmed by corrupting the sacred, you don't need religion to rule. You just need narrative. Lucrezia was the prototype of the controlled feminine. Projected as virgin, whore, witch, angel, all at once. The confusion around her wasn't accidental. It was strategic. A weaponized archetype used to teach the masses that even the most pure can be used, possessed, defiled, and still presented as holy. And that message became cultural law. Look around. Today's icons, singers, actresses, daughters of politicians, are pushed through the same machine. Sexualized young, married off for optics, silenced when they speak truth. And always framed as icons, never victims. The Borgia pattern lives on. Now listen closely, the incest wasn't the ultimate horror. The ultimate horror was that no one stopped it. Not the cardinals. Not the kings. Not the scholars. Because every man at the top understood, if Rodrigo's ritual succeeded, it meant anything could be justified. That was the hidden revelation: morality is malleable, if you control the myth. And the church was the myth-making machine of the world. Still is. You want proof? Why is Rodrigo Borgia still listed among the popes? Why has Lucrezia never been cleared? Why are there no Vatican statements addressing the known letters, diaries, and records? Because the Vatican's silence is not absence. It's policy. And that policy teaches every institution one thing: you never admit the ritual. You only repeat it, with better choreography. Now breathe. Because what comes next will test you. You've just unlocked the door to the inner sanctum. And what lies beyond is worse than history. Now we walk into the black heart of power. No more shadows. No more myth. Just the cold, mechanical precision of generational control. After Rodrigo Borgia, the Vatican didn't reform. It upgraded. You see, once the ritual was proven to work, once incest, silence, and ceremony fused into a functioning control mechanism, they didn't bury the model. They streamlined it. Quietly. Elegantly. And made it policy. The term, papal bloodline, disappeared from textbooks. But within the walls, it became everything. Because Rodrigo revealed the forbidden formula: when you bind blood with ritual, you don't just control the body, you sever the will. Lucrezia wasn't just traumatized. She was transfigured. No longer a daughter. No longer a woman. She became a system. A living interface between elite depravity and public worship. The people saw her smile. They never saw the nights she spent locked in ceremony. They never saw the bruises covered with lace. And Cesare? He was no longer brother, or son. He became executor. The holy assassin. The architect of force behind the priestly veil. Trained not in scripture, but in strategy. He studied at the University of Pisa, but his true education came in silence, learning how to convert violence into theology. This was not chaos. This was order. You see, what terrifies them about you knowing this isn't the incest. It's what the incest represents, a fracture in the illusion. Because if the Pope could desecrate his own daughter and still be worshipped, what does that say about every system built on hierarchy? What does it say about obedience? It says this: power doesn't need to be good. It just needs to be untouchable. And they've mastered that principle. Modern governments? Built on the same triangle: public morality, private depravity, absolute silence. Modern corporations? The same. PR on top. Blood rituals at the bottom. Why do you think every whistleblower vanishes? Why do you think the ones who rise highest always have something to hide? Because sin, at that level, isn't a liability. It's a requirement. Rodrigo taught them well. He taught them, if you make a man complicit in blasphemy, he will never rebel. He will protect you to protect himself. And that became doctrine. This is not about popes. This is about the machine. And now, you're standing inside it, take a breath. Because what I'm about to show you is not a story. It's a schematic. By now, you understand that Rodrigo Borgia didn't just break the rules of religion, he rewrote them. He understood that morality is a performance, and power lives in the silence between the lines. But here's the part most men will never accept: the incest was not the sickness. It was the sacrament. A sacrament of domination. Rodrigo used his daughter's body the way a priest uses a chalice, to contain something unholy, and pretend it was sacred. He wasn't just corrupt. He was performing corruption as ritual. A private theater, with Lucrezia as both stage and script, her body carved into the architecture of power. And the audience? They were initiates. Cardinals. Ambassadors. Nobles. Men who watched and said nothing. Not because they were afraid, but because they understood, to be silent is to be invited. And once you're part of the ritual, there's no turning back. You belong to it. You defend it. Now hear this: every major system that dominates your life today, government, religion, media, academia, operates off this same principle. They don't want your loyalty. They want your participation. The moment you excuse a lie, justify a crime, look the other way, you're in the ritual. You've been marked. And the Borgias taught them how to do it. Rodrigo didn't just abuse his daughter. He created a structure that ensured everyone around him became complicit in her abuse. Ambassadors wrote of her as a gift. Cardinals negotiated her like a treaty. Even artists, yes, artists, coded her into their paintings as divine femininity corrupted. So ask yourself, how many women today are being used the same way? How many families are grooming their daughters into silence, offering them up to politics, media, or billion-dollar deals with a smile and a contract? They call it networking. They call it stardom. But it's the same ritual in a new cathedral. And every time you consume it without seeing it, you kneel at the same altar Rodrigo built. This isn't just about history. It's about the pattern that controls you now. And if you're still listening, you're not just an observer anymore. You're a threat to the ritual. And threats must be silenced. Unless they finish what they started. Now we speak plainly. Rodrigo Borgia didn't simply desecrate his daughter. He redefined the idea of what family was: not love, not protection, but leverage. And that idea metastasized. In the centuries that followed, powerful families, from European royals to modern dynasties, quietly adopted the same core principle: keep the bloodline close. Keep the loyalty sealed. And keep the secrets inside. And what binds a family tighter than wealth? Than war? Shame. And the greatest shame? Shared sin. The ritual of incest, done in secret, wrapped in gold, hidden by the facade of grace, was never about pleasure. It was an initiation into silence. It ensured obedience not just in the victim, but in everyone who witnessed and stayed quiet. Now look around you. How many elite families are oddly insulated? How many scandals break, then vanish? How many celebrities marry within circles tighter than medieval kingdoms? This is not dysfunction. This is design. It's the continuation of the Borgia template: engineer shame, ritualize it, and then weaponize it. Lucrezia was the blueprint. She showed them how to turn innocence into architecture. A womb turned into a negotiation table. A smile turned into propaganda. She became a saint in paintings, a whore in the archives, and a ghost in the Vatican vaults. And that, my friend, is how power preserves itself. By ensuring the truth is too grotesque to ever be believed. And here's the bitterest twist: they make you complicit in it. They feed you dramas, documentaries, books, churches, and charities, all designed to show the surface, never the basement. They give you stories of corruption as if it's a flaw. But corruption isn't a flaw in this system. It is the system. Rodrigo was not an aberration. He was a template. And every time a church covers a scandal, every time a family buries a crime to protect its name, every time a media empire silences a voice with money, the ritual lives on. And it will never stop, until men like you decide, no more. So ask yourself. Have you come this far just to feel informed? Or are you here to become dangerous to the machine? Because you're not just learning forbidden history anymore. You're being forged by it. This is where the veil rips. You've seen the architecture, the incest, the ritual, the corruption dressed in silk. But now you must confront the core, why it all works. Why the same dark script repeats from ancient temples to modern boardrooms. Because it isn't just tradition. It's psychotechnology. Rodrigo Borgia didn't rely on swords. He weaponized the soul. He understood that the human mind, if conditioned early and broken ritualistically, becomes programmable. And once programmed, it polices itself. Lucrezia didn't escape because she couldn't. She stayed because her identity was rewritten by the very men who destroyed her. This is the deeper horror: if you violate someone early and often enough, they will protect the abuser as a form of survival. That's not a theory. That's psychological warfare. And Rodrigo didn't invent it, he optimized it. The incest wasn't only physical. It was spiritual conquest. And every man in that Vatican court knew it. They watched. They bowed. Some even replicated it in their own homes. Because once you sever your own conscience in the presence of sacred violence, you become something else. Not evil. Not holy. Just useful. And this is the lesson institutional power has never stopped teaching: break the sacred within a child, and you own the adult forever. They don't want believers. They want subjects, people trained to kneel even when the altar is burning. So now we leave history entirely. Because this is no longer about Rodrigo. It's about the world you live in. A world run by the same inverted symbols, the same silent agreements, the same unspoken rituals. Why do you think trauma is glorified in modern storytelling? Why are daddy issues meme-worthy, but never addressed? Why are we conditioned to worship brokenness, but fear true clarity? Because clarity breaks the spell. And the spell is everything. It's what keeps billions praying to systems that secretly consume them. Systems that hide abuse under prestige, incest under dynasty, rape under ritual. And the deeper you look, the more you realize, Rodrigo didn't die. He multiplied. In politicians. In CEOs. In filmmakers. In preachers. Men who smile in public and commit sacraments of power in the dark. Now you've seen the ritual. But are you ready to refuse it? Now we've finished the descent. But this is not an ending. This is a threshold. You've seen the ritual. You've stared into the abyss of power, the engineered incest, the spiritual inversion, the blood-drenched architecture hidden beneath centuries of scripture and stained glass. You've walked through the halls where Lucrezia was paraded as divine while being desecrated behind sealed doors. You now understand that Rodrigo Borgia didn't just corrupt a daughter. He redesigned the world's sacred blueprint. And the blueprint still functions. Because the ritual was never dismantled. It was refined. In every nation where corruption is too elegant to notice. In every institution that asks for your trust but never offers you transparency. In every family that silences its daughters to protect its name. In every classroom that teaches obedience before truth. You're living in a world that was built by the survivors of the Borgia experiment. Not survivors in the sense of escape, but in the sense of success. They took Rodrigo's darkness and spread it. Not through force. But through reverence. Because if you can convince people that holiness and horror can live in the same room, You can make them thank you for their chains. And here's the part that will haunt you: there is no institution powerful enough to survive Rodrigo's crimes unless it wanted to. The church survived. The myth endured. The pattern continues. And unless men like you break the chain, it will pass into the next generation. You are now initiated into dangerous knowledge. Knowledge that cuts. That changes. That burdens. You don't walk away from this unchanged. Because once you understand that power thrives not on virtue, but on the illusion of it, you see the machine for what it truly is. And now, the question becomes, will you rot in that knowledge? Or will you rise because of it? Write the phrase, "The ritual ends with me," in the comments. Write it twice. Once to break the chain. Once to begin the war. Because silence is no longer an option. Not for a man who's seen what you've seen. You've passed through the veil. And on the other side is clarity, rebellion, and fire. Don't go back. They want you passive. You were born for war. Let this be the beginning.